Who has a fun or interesting Y2K story? Anybody? You guys blacked it out too, right? Okay. Well, one of them that I have is my brother-in-law at the time was a housing contractor, and I was out visiting. And at the time, he was working on this house, and he says, "You got to come look at this thing." I said, "Well, what's going on?" He says, "You're just not going to believe it. Come look at it." Well, he had been contracted to tear out the walls of this house so that the owner could put all of his money into the walls and then wall it back up, because he was certain that the end was near. I can't make it up. That happened. The other one was, that was in western South Dakota. The other one was in Nebraska. That was interesting. And the owner discovered that they had a old fallout shelter in the backyard, and paid him to come down with a backhoe and dig the whole thing out and reconstitute this entire, Cold War era fallout shelter, because he was also convinced that things were just completely going to go south at the year 2000. So those are a couple of stories. There's a lot more than that. But I think it kind of shows, how crazy that time was, and we kind of forget about it just a little bit. We could have learned a few lessons during that time, I kind of feel. But anyway, on with the show here a little bit. I'm Pat Snow, as introduction indicated, CTO for the state. I've been here since 1996, during which time we did the Great Consolidation. And what that meant was that digital computing had grown kind of exponentially in the state through the 90s, as it did in businesses and everything else. This was the boom of the PC. I worked at Gateway Computers prior to that, so I saw them all going off the assembly line on to the rest of the world. And what the state did, like a lot of places, was in this growth, it just kind of organically kind of popped up. Some agencies, were very aggressive with networks and PCs and things like that, and they built out very quickly. Others were a little slower than that. But what that really led to was this, I would say, just kind of pocket IT throughout the state. Every agency kind of had their own staff, had their own technology, and were at various levels. When Governor Janklow first came in, he hired some consultants to come in and advised that this was not an efficient way to run government and IT. And so when I came in 96, that was job one, was to take this and consolidate it into an enterprise system that was more efficient, and we could push services out much faster. Thought that'd probably be about a 3-year job, so either I never finished it, or we got it done and I just went on to other things, and I'm not quite sure which one of those it is. But in any case, that's kind of what compute looked like. It's also when the internet started to become a big thing, right? So during that time, and the reason I'm going through all this is because it plays into how we approached, the Y2K problem at that time. Second thing is I put way too much techno jargon in this presentation, so I'm going to apologize ahead of time. As I was going through it, I was thinking, okay, some of this stuff is just probably not the right audience, but if you just stay with me, I promise it'll make sense at the end. So from an agenda perspective, this is kind of what I have laid out for us to talk about. We'll start with understanding how we got there with the Y2K bug, because I think that really is important to understand. The history can be a great teacher, as everybody here knows, and the historical pieces of technology are going to tell us how we got to the problem. We'll talk about pre-Y2K and what the tasks were in order to kind of deal with that. And then we'll talk about what really happened. What was the end result of all that effort? And then at the very end, I'm going to try to tie that all together into some things that are going on today that I think are relevant to the problem of Y2K, because we tend to repeat our mistakes. And so there's some things going on I think you might find interesting, hopefully, and just to keep your eye on as you move forward. So this is kind of a busy slide, and I'm sorry I do have a bunch of these, but starting at the beginning, the history of compute. What did it really look like? This is called ENIAC. This picture shows the first digital computer. And I think the date is relevant. It was in 1945, began work in 1943. And what was going on in 1943 and 1945? World War II. What were we doing? We were calculating vectors for artillery shells and bombs. Okay? It's a lot of math. And so the effort to build the first digital computer was strictly born out of World War II and the need to be very much faster at doing these calculations. So, what did this thing do? Well, it had about 18,000 vacuum tubes. It had about 1,500 relays, hundreds and thousands of resistors and capacitors, and what you see in the picture there is the result of that effort. It weighed 30 tons. It consumed about 150 kilowatts of energy, which, at this day and age is not a lot. But back then, that was a ton of energy just for one computer. And it could perform up to 5,000 additions and 357 multiplications or 38 divisions per second, which today is laughable, but back then, if you think about how they had to slide rule everything and do all their calculations by hand, this was a massive increase in capability. So what did they use? Like, as I said, what were they using it for? They were using it mostly for big math problems to project either artillery or bombs to A to B. And I got to thinking, well, how did they actually program this thing? What did it take to really make this thing work? Well, for each individual calculation, they had to, first of all, know how to do it by hand. So some super smart people. And figure out all those, trigonometry, geometry formulas and some calc. And then they had to, for each on every problem, they had to rewire. You see all those cables in there? They had to physically program it. It took days for one simulation. And then they could finally get it to work and they could run this thing. But it was so fast, so much faster than what they could do, it really was an enormous improvement in their capabilities. And that kind of stayed the same way for a bit. That was 45. You didn't see a lot of increases in compute for a while, and the reason was, and I want you to keep this in mind for the last half of the presentation, the reason was it was just so hard to build these things. They took up an enormous amount of space. They were all vacuum tubes. They were very unreliable. And so there was only a few of them in the world. But then something happened. And in 1954, they discovered that, we can use this thing called silicone, and we can get rid of vacuum tubes, and we can get rid of all these physical resistors and capacitors, and we can build this thing called an integrated circuit. And guess what? It's really cheap compared to having all these other devices that you had to wire together. It was exponentially less expensive. And so with the result of this material sciences breakthrough, you started to see the moving out of compute from very specialized, a lot of time government-funded agencies into more of a business type of thing, right? It was more available. It was cheaper to build. Things became easier to work with. You didn't have to wire things around. You could make things happen faster. And so right around 58, 59, you saw companies like IBM particularly start to look at this as a business unit. So this is kind of just more description of what this looked like. In the transition from math and science to data processing was fundamental in how the Y2K bug started to manifest itself. Because when you were just doing calculations, yes, you were saving some data, but you weren't really processing this massive amount of data, day by day. And so as things became a little bit more accessible to businesses, compute started to become embedded into their day-to-day processes and became very mission critical. The first one in the 1950s, the IBM 704, was really the first mass-produced computer for consumption. And it was, I think it could do about 12,000 floating point operations per second. It had a whopping 18 kilobytes of RAM, which if you remember your old PCs, they had way more than that. And it had a failure once every 8 hours. So as you can see, that was probably not really practical for a lot of people to have. There was only a couple hundred of those made. Fast forward to 1959, going back to the material sciences breakthrough, the IBM 1401, interestingly enough, didn't have any floating point operations, so it wasn't really geared for any science at all. It was all about moving data around and doing business processes. Had about 128K of RAM, so you went from 18 to 128, just from that material sciences breakthrough, okay? Then was the big guy, the IBM 360. I actually worked on a few of these, even into the 80s and 90s. They stuck around for a long time. And that was the first big mainframe that was adopted out there. It could do 16.1 million operations a second. IBM sold a ton of these through the years, and they stayed on that platform for a long time. Just from a point of comparison, your iPhone can do 35 trillion operations per second. This was the state-of-the-art machine, can do 16.1 million. And your iPhone has, depending on which version, about 8 gigabytes of RAM on it. And I'm not even going to translate that into kilobytes for you because the number is about this long. So we've come a long way as far as that goes. So this is where it all starts. Okay, early storage technology. This is the 60s, mostly. The upper right-hand corner is called a punch card. And I had the pleasure of working with a few of these. Each line you see that goes down this way, okay, that's a byte. That's 8 bits of data. So if you see a punch in there, that means it was on. So that's how you represented numbers in the early computers. So much fun. That was pervasive all the way into the 70s. And it was really tedious. Like if you could actually store information on these punch cards. So you run a bunch of data, and then it would come out. And that was the first form of a hard disk, right? You had a stack of cards about this big, and then you could run that back if you wanted to, and you could get that data back. So that was permanent storage in the 60s. The picture to the very bottom of that is called paper tape. Paper tape works on the same fundamental idea where you have these little punches in tape, but the difference is it's a lot faster than cards. Paper tape, you would feed into a spool and it would just zip through and it would read the whole thing at once. I was what was called, you know what a gym rat is? So if you're into basketball or if you're into soccer or something like that, you kind of live in the gym, you're a gym rat. I was a computer lab rat. And at college, I got trusted enough to be able to operate the university's mainframe systems because, well, let's be honest, nobody else wanted to. But I was interested, and I said, well, what's this paper tape thing? And the guy goes, oh, he shows me how you feed it through, and this is how we load if we ever have to restart the computer, this is how we do it. And then I said, okay, well, where's the other ones? No, that's the only one we have. So these things broke a lot. And so one of the things that you had to do is like scotch tape the paper tape back together so that you could actually load, make the mainframe run. So very interesting, but again, a form of permanent storage, right? Moving forward, you have your reel-to-reels. This is when things got to be more in the magnetic storage. So we went from like physical hard, paper-based product for storage into magnetic. We figured out you could use the same technology as you do for recording to store data. You can actually move data to that. So these reel-to-reels, when you hear somebody use the phrase, I need to pull that from tape, that's where that phrase came from, right? And they were still kind of slow. You can see them in the old movies where they're just kind of spinning back and forth in the background, but they were way better than paper tape and cards. So that was a big advancement, right? Then the next thing you see on the very top there, that's called DASD. That would be the 1960s, early 1970s version of a hard disk. And that was super fast. Boy, when that came out, that was a game changer because you could do things real time. You could batch things up and save things, and it was super fast compared to everything else. That one at the very top there, anywhere from 7 megabytes to 100 megabytes is what you could store. At that time, that was a lot of data. It really was. So as this became more of a mission-critical part of businesses, all this data started to come into these tapes and disks and things like that. And programmers were taught at the time, and even into the 80s, they were still taught that this is really expensive stuff, and it was. So things like dates were really important. So what was it really about? That's really what this was about. Okay, it was about how much data can we put on this very expensive medium, and how can we do it in the most efficient way. Adjusting for inflation, it was about $1 per bit. That's one of those little dots, okay? So that's $8 a byte, which is a character, $16 to store a 2-digit date, $32 to store 4. Let's just say you're a business and you have a program that runs all of your transactions for the month, and let's say you do 200,000 transactions. Okay? There was a lot of pressure on programmers to not use those other 2 digits, right? Because that was big money. That was really big money. Now, there are ways to do it. A lot of forward-thinking people would do what's called a date table, and they would create every possible date from here until like 2050, and then you'd store it one time in the computer as in permanent storage. And then when your transactions would go through, they would just point at that date. So you could get away, instead of using 4 bytes for a date, you could get away with using 1. Now the problem with that is it's very hooked into that one system. So if that data has to go anywhere, it only knows that pointer. It doesn't really have the information. So it solved the problem for some things, but it was really not a great solution for anything that had to be beyond a one accounting system or whatever else it was being used for. So over time, this just became the way things were done. And I was even, to be honest, I was even taught this in the 80s. It still was like hammered into us. And I had one professor that said, hey, I know you don't care about this today, because I was just trying to get my lab to compile, but in about 30 years, this is going to be a big problem. And he was right. He was right. So when did we really know about this? And this is a really important thing to consider, because human behavior just loves to kick the can, okay? That's Tomorrow Pat's problem. So the person that you see here, his name is Bob Beamer. And I did not know this until I started working on this presentation, and I got to wondering, I wonder who the first guy who called this out was. Bob was very prominent in the computer world. He worked for just about every big company that you can possibly call out: Honeywell, IBM, Univac, HP. He is credited with inventing the modern, what we call a character set. And a character set is how you represent letters on the screen. So the WHEN on that screen there, that's a character set, so the computer knows what to display. Bob invented that. Smart dude. He's known as the father of that. He also did a lot of work on early programming language. This guy's history was amazing. Guess when he called out the Y2K bug? Any guesses? 1957. Okay? 1957, one of the most prominent computer scientists to walk the planet said, we have a huge problem with the way we're approaching things. And we said, yeah, we know. That's all right. You understand it's real expensive, right, Bob? Okay, we'll deal with it later. So that's kind of, I think, an indication of things stacking and problems just getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and us ignoring it, because there was bigger fish to fry. That's just the way it works. So when did we really start addressing this? Since Bob told us about this in 1957, when did we really care about this? Well, in the mid-90s, media coverage started to increase, and the potential widespread disruption became more apparent. Governments and businesses worldwide initiated a lot of these campaigns, and what you see on the screen is one that I actually remember. It was produced, I believe, by the US government, and it kind of listed out all these different sectors and what the Y2K bug was and what you needed to do to start to deal with it. And at that time, we started to see this flurry of activity to try to deal with this effort as a globe, not just the US. We tend to concentrate on, just us as the United States, but this was everybody. This was everybody. We do like to scare each other. So these are some interesting little archives that I pulled out. I call this slide Feeding on the Fear because so if you think about everybody making money on Y2K, right? You had the technology companies making money. You had a lot of programmers that made a lot of money. Well, evidently we had book writers and filmmakers and everybody else was cashing in on this and stoking the fire. This is how you get people tearing out their walls and burying their money in their walls and digging up their, Cold War bunkers. Because there's the news media, the books, everybody is just feeding on this because it sells. It really does. But what were the worst case scenarios? What were the ones that were being sold? The biggest one was power grid failures. Power grids are notorious for putting things in and then just keeping it that way because it works, right? And for the most part, I don't think power grids had a big problem with this. There wasn't a lot of time-sensitive things that went on, but there were some. Like, for instance, switching relay stations because loads are changing. That's very date-sensitive, very time-sensitive. So there was some of that. The big one was, as you might guess, banking and financial systems. Okay, banking and financial. You can imagine, like, compounding interest doesn't work real well when the dates aren't right. So there was a lot of fear about that, and people did not trust the banks. There was actually some runs on the banks because of people I need to get some money out because I don't know what this is going to look like. Air traffic controllers and air disruptions, there was a lot of uncertainty. I don't think it was founded by any way, but airplanes had computers in them even back then. And there was a lot of uncertainty. People would just fall out of the air. Planes would just start dropping as soon as it kicked over. And a lot of people didn't fly. Like, there was almost no air traffic during that time, or empty planes. Telecommunications was a big one. Healthcare system failures. A little bit of anxiety on not necessarily the systems that run the business of healthcare, but the systems that run the medical equipment. And that, there were still a lot of computerized systems at that point. Those needed to be checked out. And some of them would fail. Nuclear power plants were a big one. Anybody ever been to a nuclear power plant? The systems that run nuclear power plants are very old. They have not been changed in decades. So there was there's a big concern there. A lot of them most of them work on digital VAX computers, which were invented by the same guy who invented Windows NT, which Microsoft hired away. And he was forward-thinking enough in the VAX operating system to actually take care of most of that. So those were in decent shape. And then just general public utilities. How much, we had the power grid, but how about like your water? And, all those were all part of that discussion. So as we do in government, we created a lot of councils, task force, and committees to deal with this. What you see there is on the screen there is the President's Council on Y2K. This was a pretty big deal. It engaged all the governors in all the states, and this is kind of the way the federal government does some things, is they'll create a general structure, overview of things that they think is important, and then they'll engage the states and then push that template down to the states, and then the states try to implement it for state government, and then they do the same thing for locals and counties. That's kind of how that always works for all of these things. And that was the first big thing that came out. The problem was, I think that came out in like 1998, mid 1998. So already behind the 8 ball on this stuff. You also saw a lot of advertising campaigns like this one right here, how are you sure you've done enough? I think it needed to happen, but again, we waited way too long. That's the message here, right? We knew about this a long time before it was really a problem. So I don't know if you can see this or not, and quite honestly, I'm not sure if I can, but this is Executive Order 9944, signed by Governor Janklow. If you go out to the Attorney General's webpage, you can look this up. This is a copy of it. This was a draft. And what this did was create our own state task force on Y2K. And there's some interesting language in it. Has to be balanced between the parties. Tony probably knows more about this than I do. It was had to be representative of critical infrastructure throughout the states, things like that. And it was signed directly after that. They actually acted very quickly in South Dakota on this, and we got that moving. So some of the things that we did for that is here's a draft letter, which I don't know if you can see either, but this is a draft letter that's going out to all the critical infrastructure folks, anybody else that's on that council, and basically this is, hey, you need to inventory your systems because if you don't know what you have, you can't fix it. And a lot of times, and I'll talk about this in the state government way in just a little bit, a lot of times, you build this stuff out, everybody's busy, and that's the piece that gets missed is like, what do we have? Like, how many widget X's are out there? How much of this software is out there? Where is it at? And so this was a attempt at the state government level to push to both our private partners and locals and counties and get as much inventory back as far as what they were, because at the end of the day, some of this is going to take money to fix. So you have to know what you've got before you can really start to attack it. So that was one thing that went out. Here's another one that went out. This actually went out from our commissioner at the time, Otto Dahl, and this had to do with PC technology, and this went to every cabinet secretary. It went to, I believe it went to the K-12 world, and it also went to, all the Board of Regents. And it laid out the types of, in our testing, the types of machines that would pass, and the types of machines that we had no idea, and the types of machines that we knew were going to fail. And so that's basically a structure that they could use for their PC environments to go through and say, okay, again, inventory is key here. If you don't know what you have no shot at fixing it. Another example, goes out to critical infrastructure folks. I thought this was really useful as I was looking through it because what it did is it gave all of these, whether it be public works or suppliers or local government, it gave them access to resources that were national to try to fix some of these things. There was some funding available, there was some guidance, there was a lot of things that were coming together at that time so that people could really, get focused on it. I put this in there here just because this slide is one of those slides that I look at and say, okay, well, it really is not relevant to that date, but it demonstrates the fact that these types of problems persist. So this is a daylight savings time bug that in April 2nd, 2007, in that particular time frame, a lot of the systems would fail. And it was the same type of bug. Okay. So now getting down to state government, what did we do? How did we deal with this? One of the things that is really hard to describe to folks is the scale of technology in South Dakota. So I use this background here because I think it gives you an idea of where state government is in South Dakota. We use this in our own inventory systems right now. And it gives us in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, that's where all the state facilities are, right? Scale and what you have to work with is really important here. We also looked at what are the really important pieces for state government business that need to be protected. Public safety kind of bubbled up to the top there. We run the state radio network for the state. So all your first responders and everything, they use the same network, which is awesome, but it needs to work after the year 2000. So that was a big one. Welfare and benefit distribution was really important to us. We had to make sure that's working. Tax revenue collection, got to have that. Transportation systems and public utilities, correctional facilities is a big one. Correctional facilities are very, very important that things work well. And then basically healthcare and education. So we kind of walked down the priority list, all those sectors to see where are we really at risk. I mentioned earlier that one of the first things that I was tasked with was consolidating the technology pieces of this. And if we wouldn't have done that, we wouldn't have had a fighting chance of knowing what we had. But thankfully, since we consolidated and had like one system for everybody, we could deploy inventory systems to 10,000 different endpoints and 12,000 different networking components and understand what at risk, what did we have at risk here. So as a state, what we did is we broke this up on an agency and priority basis, did the inventory. I think we came back with about 13 million records of software that needed to be vetted. That's all by memory, but I think that was the number. And then broke those up by agencies. Then we built test labs in the facility, so we had areas where software could be brought in and tested, and we just started rounding up people to come in and do these testing and work through it, bit by bit by bit. That was pretty successful. It was a lot of work. It was a lot of long weeks and weekends and everything else, but we were able to grind through most of that. And at the end of the day, it was a big component as to what we took beyond that and used as our inventorying system. I will say too that, in just thinking about that a little bit, the other thing that was rolling in and out were vendors. Like everybody wanted to sell you the magic bullet. I can remember sitting in dozens and dozens of meetings where, all you got to do is install this one widget and all your year 2000 problems go away. Well, yeah. Well, we didn't take them up on many of those. There were some very creative solutions, though. This screen here is probably where most of the real critical stuff took place. And what you see there on the screen is COBOL. It is one of the first, stands for Common Business-Oriented Language. It was invented by IBM, and it was one of the first languages that you really used for data processing. The goal for COBOL was to make it English-like, so if you read that and think it's English, I don't know what they were thinking. But anyway, it does use English words. The bulk of the main transactional-based processing still was on the mainframe in the year 2000 for the state, and most of the remediation had to do with taking this code and looking for two-digit dates. That's really what it boiled down to. And the nice thing about mainframes, and I never thought that would come out of my mouth, but the nice thing about mainframes is that they are great about knowing what they have, what programs run, where your databases are, where the data is. And so they were able to bring in some outside help to grind through all this stuff and get through it. Actually, way ahead of schedule. We were able to get that done pretty effectively. So what happened? Well, what did you guys think happened? I think everybody thought there was going to be this, either this giant boom or nothing. And I don't know if either one of them really happened, to be honest, but let's go through some of the estimates. So worldwide estimates as far as what was spent to fix Y2K, they vary. Obviously, these are inexact numbers, but it's anywhere from 300 billion to 600 billion, not adjusted for inflation. That's what was spent. United States take of that, again, estimated at 100 billion, not adjusted for inflation. Personally, we were kind of in, my team at the time was located at the Salmons building, which is on the S-curve there. And the governor activated the Emergency Operations Center. and everybody was all hands that night, New Year's. And we had kind of a war room set up, and we had every system that was critical to the state that we could think of, and that included networking infrastructure, security infrastructure. We were also afraid of some cybersecurity attacks that would try to take advantage of this. So we had a lot of that monitoring going on, and then also application testing. So it was all, pretty well thought out. Problem was I had 4 kids, and one of them was 1 year old, and I wasn't leaving them at home, even though I was very confident I wasn't going to leave my kids at home during this very critical time. So it was also kind of a daycare because a lot of other people were having that same thing. So we're working through these very complex scenarios. Meanwhile, kids are running around and, screaming. And so I looked so hard for some pictures. I couldn't find any. Anyway, the countdown starts. And I remember everybody's very focused, and of course nothing happens, right? We knew nothing was really going to happen. We tested and tested and tested. The only thing I didn't know was if somebody else's systems weren't going to break, but I knew ours were going to be okay. And then we heard boom, 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 loud cannon shots. And everybody's face just turned pale. And everybody got up and started running towards the door. This was really stupid. Why did we do that? We ran outside as fast as we could. Oh, they were fireworks. People were celebrating that the world did that. Nobody told us that. And so there was like 30 seconds of sheer terror. And then after that, we all started laughing, and it was the end of it. But that's how I spent the year 2000. And my kids still tell that story. I was actually telling my oldest daughter that I was working on this, and she goes, "I remember that, Dad." It was kind of fun conversation. So she definitely remembers where she was. Okay, so that's what happened. That was the run up to it. That's how we dealt with it. That was the end result. So now let's peer back and take some lessons from that. Okay, let's look at the future through the eyes of Y2K. You remember the ENIAC machine, the top picture there, right? This is ugly, right? All these cords. You know what that one on the bottom is? It's called a quantum computer. Okay? Even though it's colorful and a lot prettier, it's a lot alike. Okay? It's really hard to build it. It's really hard to run it. It's super expensive. It's very unreliable. And it is world-changing. Okay? And we'll talk about a little bit why that is here. And the question is, what are we doing now? What are we building into all these systems, just like we did with Y2K, that's going to become a crisis-level event sometime? And that's what we're doing. Every time you open your browser, you go to a website, you'll see a little S on the HTTP. That means it's encrypted, right? Anytime that you log in using a user ID and password, it's encrypted. There's a ton of different things that use encryption. Here's a eye chart that I'm sure you can't read. But it's used in secure communications, whether I'm on a phone call, whether I'm on a cell phone, whether I'm sending a text message. Well, text, not really, but other messages. It's used in data security, so when I'm saving things to my hard disk, a lot of times there's some encryption there. There's financial transactions. I talked about digital identity. That's your user ID and password. Internet of Things. How many people have door cams and things like that? Yeah, okay. So that's all. There's an encryption layer there that's all built into that system. They don't want somebody just being able to, hook up to your wireless and see everything that's on your internal systems. Government and military communications, very important. Healthcare, data processing, digital rights management, that's music. Secure software development, academic research. Encryption is being baked into everything. And it's fundamental to making things work. Anybody own any Bitcoin? No? Me either. And this is why. So Bitcoin is based on a system called blockchain. Okay, blockchain is basically a digital ledger of events that happen, and it's a distributed system, so you can't just hack one system. There's a whole bunch of other systems out there that have to agree on everything and then encrypt it on the same way. And if anything goes wrong in between that, the whole system just throws its arms up and says, no, that's not going to happen. It's a very secure system, super secure. And some of the best minds in encryption available have worked on it for years. And there's a lot of money behind it, but the problem with it is we have this quandary, and that is quantum computing. Quantum computing, if you say you understand it, you don't, okay? It's built on, and I certainly don't, it's built on quantum mechanics, which Einstein identified with a bunch of other smart people back in the day, called spooky action at a distance, in which they can entangle a bit and make it operate any way they want. And it'll do that until it's observed, and then it stops, okay? I know that made no sense, but that's how it works. Traditional computers operate on ones and zeros, very predictable. I know how much data I have, and I know how many cycles it'll take to process that. I can predict exactly how long it'll take. Encryption works that way. Encryption is worked on mathematical functions that are very easy to create and very hard to undo, okay? So if I have two prime numbers, giant prime numbers, and I use that as my encryption key, you being able to find that with a traditional computer, very hard. So as an example, one of the most commonly used encryption mechanisms out there uses 240-bit, 48-bit RSA encryption. With a classical computer, the most powerful one we have today, it'd take over 100 years to crack a single encryption key with it. And that's just brute forcing prime numbers. That's all it's doing. Estimates for quantum is about 10 seconds. Okay, and the reason why it's so much faster is a traditional computer has to loop and loop and loop and loop and loop and loop, and it can only go as fast as it can keep trying to break this, right? A quantum computer can observe all possible conditions simultaneously because it's in multiple states. Those bits are in multiple states. It's zeros and ones at the same time and anything in between. So it can look at these giant, hard-to-solve mathematical problems, and it can do every possible observable condition almost simultaneously, depending on how many qubits you have. So that's why encryption's in danger. And so if we get this wrong, and we, quantum, I forgot to mention one thing. Based on our previous conversation, how is quantum going to get in front of us?
We're going to put it off.
Material sciences. Why is it difficult to make a quantum computer? Well, look at that thing. I mean, it's really hard. Okay, it has to be kept at near zero temperatures. Like, not just zero, I'm talking absolute zero, in order to make this thing work. It's very difficult. And the reason it has to be kept at zero is because we haven't got the material sciences quite right in order to mass produce this thing. When that changes, we're going to see this roll out exactly like silicone. It's not going to be silicone, it'll be something else. But it'll be just like silicone. And then you're going to see encryption have a problem. So if anybody, that's my crystal ball. What are we doing today that is going to cause the same type of problem? It's that kind of stuff, because we're not looking at what it's going to look like in the next 10 years. And I was given the 5-minute hook here, so I'm going to go to Q&A.
When you're talking about encryption, and if we get one bit or piece out of sequence or dropped, what's the possibility of computers giving us an answer to a question we did not ask?
Oh, I think there's always a possibility of computers giving an answer to a question he didn't ask.
There's things asking all the time, where a segment comes out like a piece of DNA drops out of one of the RNA, DNA, whatever drops out, you get a different result on the end.
Yeah.
And so that's an answer, but we weren't asking for that answer. We were asking something else, and we get a different response.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you know, that question can be applied to just about anything within the whole realm. I mean, if your data or your information integrity is compromised, well, your result set's already dead, right? You're not going to get the right answer that you want at that point. So there's a good chance of that happening if in fact, that's why blockchain is so important in some of this stuff, because it's really hard for that to happen. Like, it's a ledger. Things have to happen in a certain sequence in a digital way, and it's really hard for that to not happen 100% every time, because there's so many systems involved.
One group of people that you left out that Y2K affected.
TV evangelists.
I'm sure I went to bed before midnight, but for those who are concerned about Y2K, were you watching previous time zones as they switched to midnight?
Yes. That's a great question. For sure, because obviously it doesn't all happen at the same time, right? So we definitely were doing that. You know, places that had already rolled over, that gave us a lot more confidence, to be honest with you. And so places that had rolled over previous, we were like, okay, they're good. So this is looking good. Now, it's not like nothing happened. There were a few situations where some of the medical equipment did fail. There were certain countries, I think there were a couple in Europe, where they did have some critical infrastructure that did fail, but it was very small on the scale of things that we were talking about. But yeah, great question on that.
I was looking at, you're talking about blockchain. When they talk about how much energy blockchain uses, like, like the whole city of Phoenix, just so they can make, like one thing.
Yeah.
Is that something that you think will get cheaper, or is it? It doesn't seem like a good thing to me, but I don't know about it.
I'm probably the wrong person to answer that, because I think the technology behind blockchain is tremendous. But because of what we just talked about, I don't know if that's going to be the case, honestly. Because I think there'll be some disruptive technology in the next 3 or 4 years that might make it completely just go away.
Like quantum computing?
Yeah. Yep.
Like that could change everything?
It will definitely change. It depends on the timing of it. Like, it really does depends on the timing. Depending on how dark you want to go here. Like, if we get it wrong, and other nation states get there first, that's a bad, really, really bad thing for us. Especially if there's a material sciences breakthrough in states that aren't friendly to us. That puts them in a tremendous technical advantage. So we need to get it right. And when it does roll out, it needs to be not necessarily like we did PCs, right? It's too much, it's too different. So there needs to be some regulations and controls around it. Otherwise, it will get into the hands of bad actors, and things like Bitcoin are at risk, a big risk.
So it's like a little bit like not World War II. I hate being old. Yes, the Cold War. Yes, it's like the Cold War. It's like, we don't want to do this. We don't really want to have AI running around. We don't really want to have quantum computers. But we don't do it the Chinese way.
Yes, it's definitely it's an arms race, right? It's definitely an arms race. And what I do feel good about is that historically, the U.S. has led with the innovation, and everybody else has copied just in this space, right? Especially recently. And I think we still have that. I don't know how big the gap is. It's really hard to know, but I think we have some brilliant people working on it. So.
When you mentioned looking for pictures of the New Year's event, while you were preparing for this, did you find materials that you think should be archived? Not to put my colleagues on the spot.
We know a guy.
Yeah, I know a guy. Anything else? Thank you very much for listening to me today. And I know I've kept you in between your refreshments, so please enjoy. Thank you.